Have you ever gotten genuinely angry because somebody said a band that you love sucks? Not annoyed, not amused, angry. Somebody you've never met, somebody who probably doesn't know you exist, says that band's fucking terrible. And somehow you feel the need to defend them. Maybe you argue, maybe you start explaining why they're wrong. Maybe you start listing albums. Maybe you pull out some obscure piece of information that you absolutely did not need to know, but somehow know anyway. And maybe 5 minutes later, you realize something incredibly fucking stupid was happening. You're arguing with a stranger about music. But here's the part I find interesting. Why? Why do we care? Why isn't it enough to say, I like this, you don't, cool? Why does somebody else's opinion about the music we love sometimes feel like a challenge that needs to be answered? Because if you really think about it, they didn't insult the music. They insulted something that we've attached to the music. And that's where this gets interesting. Because maybe the reason metalheads fight so fucking much about music isn't because we care too much about music. Maybe it's because we've made music mean far more than music. Welcome back to Negative Frequencies. And today we're talking about one of my favorite things about heavy music. How fucking impossible it is to talk about. Because metal fans don't merely disagree. We can turn disagreement into fucking constitutional crisis. Is this death metal? Is this deathcore? Is this black metal? Is this actually heavy? Is this band authentic? Did they sell out? Is this album a classic? Is this new shit better than the old shit? And underneath all of those arguments is a much more interesting question. Why do we care so much? Because objectively speaking, none of that matters. A genre label isn't going to change your life. A band being popular doesn't physically hurt you. Somebody enjoying an album you hate doesn't take anything away from your copy of the album. And yet, we fight. So today I want to figure out why. Let's start with something that seems obvious. Music is subjective. We've already talked about this in the series. Two people can hear the exact same song and have completely different reactions. One person hears something incredible, another hears absolute trash. Neither person necessarily has defective ears. They simply experience the music differently. So you'd think that would make music arguments relatively easy. You like it, I don't, end of story. Except that's not how humans behave. Because we don't usually experience our preferences as completely arbitrary. When we love something, we tend to build reasons around that love. We don't just say, I like this. We say, I like this because it's authentic, because it's heavier, because it's more technical, because it has better songwriting, because it captures the spirit of the genre. And sometimes those explanations are perfectly legitimate. But notice what we've done. We've taken I like this and turned it into this is good. Those are not the same statement. And that little shift is where a tremendous amount of musical warfare begins. The difference between taste and judgment. Here's a simple example. I can tell you, I don't like modern pop music. That statement is about my taste. But if I tell you modern pop music is objectively shitty music, I've made a completely different kind of claim. Now I'm asking you to accept my judgment. And once we move from preference to judgment, disagreement becomes much easier. Because now we're not saying we like different things. We're saying one of us is wrong. And humans fucking love being right. especially about things they've invested themselves in. That's where music criticism can become surprisingly emotional. Why metal makes this even worse. And I think that heavy music creates an especially fertile environment for this kind of argument, because metal isn't just one sound. It's an enormous collection of scenes, traditions, aesthetics, histories, identities, and subcultures, which means people aren't simply deciding whether they like a song. They're often deciding whether something belongs, and belonging matters. If you tell someone, I don't like that song, that's easy. If you tell them that isn't real death metal, you've changed the conversation entirely. Now you're making a claim about a category. And if somebody has spent years identifying themselves with that category, you've potentially made the conversation personal. Think about how often we use the word real when talking about music. Real metal, real punk, real underground, real fans, real musicians, real songwriting. That word is doing an incredible amount of work, because real doesn't simply mean or imply this exists. It means or implies this meets the standards I believe define the thing. And those standards didn't come from nowhere. They came from somewhere. Your experiences, the records you grew up with, the people who introduced you to the music, the scene that you came from, the things you were told mattered, the things you rejected, the things you eventually adopted as your own. So when somebody violates those standards, it can feel like they're violating the thing itself, and sometimes it can feel like they're violating you. Which brings us to one of the most powerful words in heavy music: poser. You knew we were going to get here. It's fascinating, because calling somebody a poser isn't really an argument about their musical taste. It's an accusation about their legitimacy. You're saying you don't actually belong here. And historically, I understand why that concept exists. Subcultures form identities partly by distinguishing themselves from the mainstream. If you're part of something that feels different, you develop ways of recognizing the people who genuinely participate in it. But eventually, that instinct becomes pathological, because once belonging becomes important enough, people start policing the boundaries, and suddenly someone isn't merely enjoying the wrong band. They're suspicious. Maybe they're wearing the wrong shirt. Maybe they discovered the band too recently. Maybe they don't know enough history. Maybe they like something the wrong kind of fan likes. And then the question becomes, who gets to belong? That's a much bigger question than music. And there's the part that nobody likes admitting. Gatekeeping can feel fucking good, because knowledge creates status. If you've spent years learning about something and someone walks in knowing almost nothing, there can be a little psychological reward in knowing that you know more. You become the person who can explain things, the person who remembers the obscure record, the person who knows where the sound came from, the person who can identify the genre, the person who can tell you that the band you're calling black metal is actually atmospheric sludge with blackened elements. And yes, I'm aware of how ridiculous that sounds when you say it out loud. But knowledge isn't the problem. Using knowledge to establish superiority is the problem. There's a difference between, hey, if you like this, you should check out this band too, and you don't belong here because you don't know this. One creates community, the other creates hierarchy. And this is where things get a little weird. Metal was never supposed to be completely comfortable. A lot of heavy music grew around the idea of rejecting convention, rejecting mainstream expectations, polished presentation. the idea that music had to be accessible, and yet subcultures can eventually develop their own rules that are just as rigid. The outsiders create their own inside, and then they start deciding who's sufficiently outside. That's the irony. We reject the mainstream because we don't want to be told what to like, and then sometimes turn around and tell each other what we're allowed to like. But there's something deeper happening there, because if all of this were simply about music, the arguments wouldn't hurt very much. Somebody says, I hate your favorite band. You shrug, who gives a fuck? But sometimes we don't shrug. Why? Because music is attached to memory, and memory is attached to identity. An album can belong to a period of your life. A song can remind you of somebody. A band can represent a time when you were figuring out who the hell you were. Maybe you discovered them when you were 15. Maybe you heard them when you were angry. Maybe their music was there when everything else in your life felt unstable. Maybe you went to a show and met people who eventually became your closest friends. At that point, you're not just defending the band, you're defending a memory of yourself. And I think that's why some music criticism hits harder than it logically should. Think about your favorite album. Forget whether it's objectively good. Forget production, musicianship, genre, anything. Ask yourself, when did I first hear it? Where were you? Who were you with? What did your life look like? What did you believe then? What were you afraid of? What did you want? What did you think you were going to become? Because there's a very good chance that when you hear that album now, you're not only hearing the album, you're hearing yourself at that time. That's powerful. But it also creates a problem. If someone dismisses that music, they don't know they're touching any of that. They only know they're talking about the record. You know they're talking about something else. And this is where I think we make another mistake. We confuse somebody having a different emotional response with them making an incorrect assessment. If a song means something profound to me, and it means absolutely nothing to you, neither of us has necessarily misunderstood the song. We experienced it differently. But humans are incredibly uncomfortable with the idea that something can be deeply meaningful without being universally meaningful. We start looking for objective explanations, better riffs, better production, better lyrics, vocals, songwriting. Those can be discussed. They can be analyzed. They can be even compared. But none of them can completely explain why a particular piece of music matters to a particular person. And that's the part we can't quantify. There's another reason we fight, too. Community. Music gives people groups to belong to. And once you belong to that group, the group identity starts affecting how you think. You don't just have your own taste. You become aware of what your people like, and sometimes what your people are supposed to dislike. That's where music becomes tribal as fuck. You start learning the unofficial boundaries. This band is respected. That band is embarrassing. This album is essential. That album's overrated. This genre is legitimate. That genre is a bastardization. And again, some of these opinions can be perfectly reasonable. The problem begins when disagreement becomes evidence that somebody isn't one of us. And here's something I find particularly interesting is sometimes we defend music we don't even listen to anymore. Think about that. You may have outgrown a band. You may not have played that album in 10 years. You might even admit that some of the music hasn't aged particularly well. And yet, if somebody mocks it, you're suddenly ready to defend. Why? Because sometimes we're not defending the current music. We're defending the person we were when we loved it. That's why that's a very different thing. And it explains why nostalgia can be so powerful. You're not only remembering a song, you're remembering the version of yourself who needed that song. And this is where I think the whole thing can become unhealthy. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm a metalhead. That's perfectly normal description of your interest. But the more completely we define ourselves through a particular identity, the harder it becomes to tolerate anything that threatens that identity. Because if the music is just something you enjoy, criticism is easy to ignore. But if the music is part of who you are, criticism can feel like rejection. And suddenly, a discussion about an album becomes a discussion about your legitimacy. That's when people stop listening, because the goal is no longer understanding. The goal is defense. Here's where I don't want this episode to go. I don't think the answer is everyone should stop arguing about music. That would be fucking boring. Arguments about music can be incredible. They can expose people to new ideas. They can introduce you to bands you never would have found. They can force you to articulate why you love something. They can make you reconsider something you thought you understood. And honestly, sometimes arguing about music is just fucking fun. I don't want to take that away. The problem isn't disagreement. The problem is when disagreement becomes identity warfare. There's a difference between I think you're wrong and you're not one of us. There's a difference between I think that album sucks and anyone who likes that album has terrible taste. There's a difference between defending an opinion and defending your right to belong. Those things can look very similar from the outside. Psychologically, they're not. So maybe the question isn't, why do metalheads argue so much? That's easy, because we're human. Humans argue about everything they care about: sports, movies, politics, food, religion, and yes, fucking metal. The more interesting question is, why does music become important enough to argue about in the first place? And I think we've gotten closer to the answer because music can become part of your identity. It can give us a community. It can preserve memories. It can tell us where we came from. It can tell other people who we think we are. And sometimes it can give us a place where we finally feel like we belong. That's why an argument about music can feel like more than an argument about music. And this is where I think things get even more interesting. Because if music can become part of your identity, then there's another question we have to ask. When does that happen? When does I like this music become this is my music? When does preference become community? When does community become identity? And what happens when that identity changes? Because maybe the strange thing about loving music isn't that we fight about it. Maybe it's that something made of sound, something that exists for 3 minutes or 5 minutes or an hour, can become part of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. And if you've ever stopped listening to a genre you once loved, if you've ever looked back at an old version of yourself and wondered how you could possibly have been that person, If you've ever felt strangely guilty for leaving a scene behind, then you already know where we're going next. When does music stop being something we listen to and start becoming something we are? I don't think we fight about music because we're stupid. I don't think we fight about music because metalheads are uniquely obnoxious. I definitely don't think we should stop arguing. I think we fight because we care. Sometimes we care about the music itself. Sometimes we care about what it represents. And sometimes we care about what it says about us. But maybe there's a difference between caring deeply about something and needing everybody else to agree with you. You can love an album without proving it's objectively great. You can hate a band without needing everyone else to hate them. You can disagree about a genre without deciding who belongs. And you can argue your ass off about music without turning the person on the other side of the argument into your enemy, at least in theory. This is still YouTube, so let's not get carried away. So now I want to hear from you. What's a band or album you will absolutely defend even though you know plenty of people think it's fucking terrible? Have you ever gotten genuinely angry over somebody else's opinion about music? And here's the harder question. Have you ever changed your opinion about a band because of an argument that somebody with somebody else? Or do you think music taste is one of those things where once you decide what you love, nobody is changing your mind? And finally, do you think metal culture has become too obsessed with deciding who's a real fan? I genuinely want to know where you land on this. Leave your answers in the comments. Argue with me. Argue with each other. Just give me something worth arguing about. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button, subscribe to Negative Frequencies, click on that bell so you can get notifications when the next one drops, and stick around for the season 1 finale. Because we've spent this entire season pulling apart music, and now we're getting dangerously close to the person listening to it. When music becomes identity, that's next. Negative Frequencies takes the music we love, pulls it apart, and asks what the hell it says about the people listening to it. I'll see you guys in the next one.